Good morning, everybody. I am so excited to be part of this program, and I thank John Waldman for arranging a program which is so diverse. I feel like I'd like to comment on all the presentations that have been made so far, because mine juxtaposes and includes a lot of what people have said. But I'll let my commentary speak for itself, and it'll already will reinforce some of the things that you've heard. Flushing Remonstrance. I think that was the first thing we heard about from President of Queens College, and this is probably the most important thing that ever happened here. It leads to the First Amendment to the it's not the amendment, it's leads to our Bill of Rights and to the first Declaration of religious freedom, first declaration from the people of religious freedom in North America. Some people may know of Roger Williams' colony in Providence, Rhode Island, which promised religious freedom to people that settled there, but that's from the top down. This is the first time the voice of the people were heard in declaring religious freedom. Most of the time in the 17th century, in most places, church and state were one. Flushing Remonstrance said, people have a right to practice what they want here, freedom of conscience. This was tested. This was a reaction to Governor Stuyvesant from Holland, who was bothered by the Quakers. He had already reluctantly let in Jews and other Protestants that were not of the Dutch Reformed faith, but he didn't like the Quakers. The Quakers were threatening. First of all, they believed in peace and they wouldn't fight for you. Second of all, they didn't really have ministers, and they didn't have set prayers, and they didn't sing hymns. And they had a very unorthodox form of worship where people just spoke up whenever they wanted to. This all was very threatening because religious structure was more from the top down. You had a priest that you could deal with. You couldn't really deal with these people en masse. They were threatening. And in Flushing, there was already an incident that went against Stuyvesant. Someone was arrested and fined for allowing the Quakers to worship in someone's home. The people of Flushing stood up to Stuyvesant and wrote a remarkable document called the Flushing Remonstrance, which I wish I could read to you here. I don't have enough time. But I suggest you go on the internet, look up Flushing Remonstrance, and read this remarkable document which calls for freedom of conscience. People should be allowed, and these were not Quakers that wrote it. These were the townsmen of Flushing who were from mixed English backgrounds, mixed church backgrounds, and were not particularly religious themselves, but they would believe that people should be able to worship together. You'll be surprised who it mentions in that document. This is John Bound's house on Bound Street, which really tested the Flushing Remonstrance and tested Peter Stuyvesant. John Bound allowed, several years after the document was published, John Bound allowed Quakers to worship on his land. In fact, he was involved already with a Quaker woman. He wasn't a Quaker himself. He became a Quaker and allowed people to worship on his land, and he was arrested. He was sent to Holland to jail for 2 years and then put on trial. He was found innocent because the Constitution of Holland and the Charter for Flushing said freedom of conscience, and ever since then we've had freedom of religion in Flushing, and then eventually in New York City, and eventually in the United States of America, because that's in our Constitution. A groundbreaking thing that started here in Queens and Flushing. This is a monument right across the street from the Bound House. I'm sorry that some of these slides are a little fuzzy in focus. This one is hard to see anyway unless you're there in person. It's a monument to George Fox, who spoke there in 1672 across the street from the Bound House. George Fox is widely recognized as the founder of the Quaker religion, and he spoke to his flock there in Flushing in 1672. This is the catalog of the first nurseries in North America. They were Robert Prince's nurseries, founded in 1737. Flushing has remarkable soil, something that John Woolman didn't mention in his talk, but there are remarkable soils in Flushing. The northern part of Long Island, where the glacial moraine, north of the glacial moraines, has pockets of very good soil, which are very good for building nurseries, not just general farming, but for hybridizing various plants and growing plants for sale to other people who are producing gardens or farming themselves. And the first nurseries in North America were the Prince nurseries. They lasted for about 3 or 4 generations into the 19th century by the time that other nurseries also began developing in Flushing and Queens as well. So Flushing is the nursery capital of North America. The first nurseries were here, and it's where plants from Europe and local plants were hybridized for hardiness. In the same way that I believe what is happening here, we've got the people now who are coming from all over the world, and they're being hybridized for strength in a new Queens. So I'm going to be ending up with that. I used to say to Chuck Wade, who was the director of the Queens Botanical Gardens, first came the plants, then came the people. The biggest nursery ever here was the Parsons Nursery. 3 generations of the Parsons family founded and increased the land of the Parsons Nursery. One of the things they did was bring in the famous weeping beech tree, which is the parent of all the weeping beech trees in the United States. It sat in Weeping Beech Park. It lasted for about 150 years. About 10 years ago it died, but its children still survive. And its offspring are all over the country, practically all. We believe that all the weeping beech trees in North America come from this one weeping beech tree in Flushing. This is the 3rd generation of the Parsons family. This is Samuel Bound Parsons, Jr., who really expanded the Parsons nurseries. If you are familiar with Kissena Park, part of Kissena Park was donated by the Parsons nurseries and still contains trees that were planted by the Parsons Nursery and are left to grow there. Much of the land for Flushing High School was donated by the Parsons Nursery. Samuel Bound Parsons himself was a landscape architect, and he was the designer of parks in Washington, D.C. and in San Diego. If you've ever been to Balboa Park in San Diego, he also laid out college campuses in Philadelphia, Haverford College, Bryn Mawr College. He was a Quaker, and those are Quaker schools. He was superintendent of Central Park for a while and was also president of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Very highly respected in his profession, and his work has spread throughout the United States. Samuel Bound Parsons, Jr. This is Forest Hills Gardens. We saw a picture of this once before. Forest Hills Gardens is the quintessential garden city. Garden City was a concept developed in 19th century England where new suburban railroads were branching out, and real estate investors were buying land along those railroads and creating garden cities where beautiful suburban housing. There were a lot of rules about what the houses could be constructed of and how they could be set back and how the landscaping would look. Forest Hills Gardens is the quintessential garden city in North America. It's quoted in all the planning books. It was pretty much started in 1909 as the Long Island Railroad was electrified and the Forest Hills Station was opened. This is Jackson Heights, which pioneered the concept of the garden apartment. These are 6-story buildings grouped around the central garden. This is the Towers Apartments at 81st Street and 34th Avenue, which stretches out to Northern Boulevard. Beautiful 20th century planning garden apartments. The term garden apartment originates with Jackson Heights. This is Sunnyside Gardens, which Jeff Kressler showed you before, where he lives. These were simple row houses, but they were developed on the garden concept so that the whole of the backyards was devoted to a garden. Very tiny patios that people had, but the rest of the backyard space was devoted to a community garden in the similar way that Jackson Heights had those backyard gardens as well. This is the same concept here, Sunnyside Gardens. This is Conrad Poppenhusen. Now, Poppenhusen is the one that developed that hard rubber factory in College Point that someone spoke of earlier. He is also known for for giving the community the first free kindergarten, public kindergarten in North America. I don't know if other cities came to visit his kindergarten and opened kindergartens on his model, but this is the first free kindergarten in North America. But I bring him up here because he did something else. He is really the father of the integrated Long Island Railroad. The Long Island Railroad that we know today is really a number of separate lines, and he's a famous person, and this guy is Alexander Turney Stewart, who really developed the first modern department store, but that was in Manhattan. And lots of people who made money in New York, they made money in transportation, or they made money selling furs, or they made money, in this case, in department stores. What they usually do to make more money is go into real estate. And Stewart's real estate project was Garden City, Long Island. He bought the land that Garden City, Long Island sits on, but he needed a way to get there. And he went into partnership with Poppenhusen to build a rail line from Flushing to Garden City, Long Island, so he could develop Garden City into a Garden City. That has something to do with the National Rifle Association starting in Queens, believe it or not. So the next few slides will explain that. This is the NRA, which also begins in Queens, and that's been in the news a lot lately. This is the Garden City Hotel, which was built in 1874, after the railroad that Poppenhusen and Stewart built to Garden City from Flushing. This is the Garden City Hotel in 1904. It's a new structure, and if you can read the print there, it's also the home of the American, let's see, what did they call it then? The headquarters of the Automobile Club of America, which is one of the organizations that preceded the American Automobile Association, the AAA. So that was headquartered in Garden City. That's the beginning of car stuff. This is Creedmoor State Hospital. Creedmoor State Hospital, I'll tie this all together for you. Creedmoor State Hospital sits on land that was owned by the Creed family farm. In order to build that railroad, Poppenhusen and Stewart had to buy the land from the Creed family farm. And they sold the land. They needed people to be along that rail line, and they sold the land that they didn't use for the rail line to the National Rifle Association for practice grounds. The National Rifle Association went into partnership with the New York State Militia, and every year there were rifle competitions in that area on what used to be the Creed family farm, renamed Creedmoor. The National Rifle Association was not popular in Queens. The area was being more heavily populated, and there was fear of the gunshots and gun accidents, whatever. This is difficult to see, but you can see Creedmoor on the upper left, and there's a little railroad spur that's left over from that railroad. That railroad went over the glacial moraine along Rocky Hill Road, which we now know as Springfield Boulevard. On the other side of Creedmoor is Winchester Boulevard. In this part of Queens Village, there are also some streets named Musket, Range, and Sabre. You'll see them all on the map, all referring to rifles and, guns and military activity that existed in this part of Queens Village from about 1870 until 1912, when the NRA and the New York State Militia moved out, and the area was taken over by the New York State hospitals, and they built the Creedmoor Mental Institution. There is another lingering thing. If you look up rifles, you will find that there is a brand of rifle called the Creedmoor. The 6.5 refers to the millimeters of the barrel, and it's a hunting rifle. And there are many other Creedmoor rifles for sale that bear the name of Creedmoor, which goes back to the Creed farm in Queens. Now, getting back to that road, getting back to the geography of Queens in that area, this is the corner of Peck Avenue and 199th Street. On the left is Cunningham Park. On the right is the low-rise section of the Fresh Meadows housing development. This is the beginning of the first limited access motor vehicle parkway ever. So Queens is the site of the first motor parkway. It was called the Vanderbilt Motor Parkway. It was built in the first decade of the 20th century as a private road by William Vanderbilt of the Vanderbilt family, which was used, people could use it, pay a toll, or they sometimes had car races on it. This road stretched out to Ronkonkoma in Suffolk County. This is the road today as it goes through Alley Pond Park. This is the road in the 30s when it still existed as a toll road. This is someplace out in Nassau County. This is one of the overpasses. This is the overpass over 73rd Avenue. This overpass existed when this road was built. So this is at 199th Street and 73rd Avenue. The road was a limited access road that went in Queens through what is now Cunningham Park and Alley Pond Park, and it's preserved as a bicycle trail and hiking trail. So Queens had the first motor parkway, and Queens sold motor parkways, later expressways, to America. At this first World's Fair in 1939, 1940, the most popular exhibit was General Motors Futurama. And you can see in the background, whoops, where's my, in the background you can see these people, and they're sitting in little chairs, and they're going around this exhibit, which is the world of tomorrow. What is the world of tomorrow? It's all expressways. So that whole concept of expressways and the the interstate highway network that was realized some 20, 25 years in this country was really sold as a fantasy in Queens in 1939, and people loved it. It was the most popular exhibit, and there are people, of course, they're not walking around this exhibit, they're riding around this exhibit. And they're riding around the world of tomorrow, which has all these skyscrapers and superhighways, no subways. In the 30s, Queens developed two things that you probably, well, one you use every day and another one you may use every day. King Kullen was America's first supermarket. This picture is taken at Bethpage, where King Kullen still exists. This is corporate headquarters of King Kullen, but King Kullen was the first supermarket in America, in the world, and it was in Jamaica Avenue, on Jamaica Avenue, just west of the Jamaica Avenue Business District, which used to end at 168th Street, because that's where the elevated train ended. And there is a plaque on a building. This is the only photo I have of it, and you can't read it, but you can probably see King Kullen on it. Recently, I was doing a walking tour for people on Jamaica Avenue, and I wanted to show them this plaque. I couldn't find it. I kept passing by the spot where I knew it was, but it's at 171st, just east of 171st Street on Jamaica Avenue, and then I finally figured out what had happened. The bakery with the blue awning, that's over here, there's a sign for rent, an apartment, and the plaque was behind the sign for rent. I talked to the people in the bakery that they know that they were in an historical building where the world's first supermarket was, and of course they had no idea that they were in the world's first supermarket. King Kullen was an immediate success. It was started by a gentleman named Michael Kullen, who had worked for the Kroger Company. Kroger was a chain of grocery stores. I'm old enough to remember when my mother shopped in a grocery store. It was a Bohax. You walked into a store that was no bigger than a Latino bodega would be today, and Joe was behind the counter, and you told Joe that you wanted a can of Campbell soup, and he'd reach up with one of these clipper things, and he'd bring you down a can of Campbell soup. And then Joe would write down everything on a brown paper bag and add it up. There were no cash registers. What Kullen did was bring together the concept of the shopping cart, the cash register, the checkout lanes, the aisles of a supermarket, and develop the modern supermarket. It was copied in an immediate success, and it spread all over the country in the 1930s. Scrabble was invented in Queens, also in the 1930s. An unemployed architect by the name of Alfred Butts, who lived in Jackson Heights, invented the game. His wife tested it out in the community house of the Methodist Church at 81st Street and 37th Avenue. This is a picture of the installation of the street sign in the Jackson Heights Historic District, and you can see on the, if you're a Scrabble player, you can see that the letters have the point value of each of the letters here. So H is 4, and V is 4, and E is 1. And that sign exists on the corner. And Butts actually designed the community house for the church, which is next to the church. There's the sign that's up, and to the left of the church, the Methodist Church, is the community house that Butts designed, and that's where the game was first played by his wife. And now, Scrabble exists in many languages, played all over the world. I'm a competitive Scrabble player. I had the pleasure of meeting Alfred Butts before he died, and the pleasure of attending that ceremony of the installation of the sign. Back to the World's Fairs, which are the creation of so many things in Queens that spread to the rest of America. If you're old enough to remember the last World's Fair, which was 64, 65, this was probably the most important spot for people. That was the Belgian Village. It was unique. That was a recreation of a little town in Belgium. And the thing that everybody wanted to do at that World's Fair was eat this. Everybody who went remembers the introduction of Belgian waffles. Now you'll see them on the menu of every diner in the country, a Belgian waffle, but we didn't know about Belgian waffles before. Other thing that was introduced at that fair was the picture phone. And there was an arrangement set up with Disneyland in Southern California, and people could arrange in advance at the World's Fair in Flushing Meadow to talk to someone in California and get the picture phone transmission. So this is the beginning of the picture phones that you all have. Of course, the technology is by cell phones now, and it's all very, very different. But this is the first time that people were able to see each other while talking on the phone. This is back in 1964. This is the World's Fair New York City building as it looked like in 39. The symbols of the World's Fair were the Trilon, the tall building, and the spherical building called the Perisphere. We're looking at the back of the World's Fair, of the New York City building. This is the same building after the fair was over. From 1946 to 1950, it became the site of the United Nations, before the United Nations was built. And in fact, two of the more important decisions of the United Nations were made on this site. One, the settlement of the disputes between Israel and the Palestinians and the creation of that boundary, and also the settlement of the disputes between Pakistan and India and the creation of that boundary. However, unfortunately, those countries are still disputing with one another, so they weren't lasting. But this is the entrance of the United Nations into New York, and the delegates had to find places to live in New York. Eventually, the UN moved to Manhattan. But the people who worked in the UN embassies, the secretaries and the drivers and the middle class and working class people who worked at the UN, they couldn't afford to live in the townhouses that the people in Manhattan lived in. They lived in Queens. And so the beginnings of the foreign immigrant communities in Queens really start with the UN here being here in 46 to 50. Also, another problem was that the people of color who came from Latin America, from Africa, and from Asia had a hard time finding housing because those were days of legal prejudice in housing. Many places had restrictive covenants that said no blacks here, maybe no Jews here, no Asians here, whatever. A lot of people had difficulty finding housing because it was legal to practice prejudice in that sense. There was a couple of developments in the late 40s in Queens that began to fight that. One was the building of a housing project called Parkway Village, which is located at Union Turnpike and Main Street. And Parkway Village was built specifically for UN personnel, and all manner of people lived there. Betty Friedan lived there, Ralph Bunche lived there, Roy Wilkins lived there, and so there was an integrated community that sprung up in Queens in the late 40s. Called Parkway Village. At the same time, one of the communities that practiced segregation and had restrictive covenants was called Addisley Park in St. Albans. And the Supreme Court, for the first time, overruled their covenant, and the first black purchaser of the first colored person to purchase a home in St. Albans was done by a Supreme Court order. And so that's the first time that rule was overturned. Now, this is the United Nations School today. It's in Jamaica Estates. The first United Nations School was on the grounds of Parkway Village, where the kids of the various delegates went to a school that they could call their own with all kinds of kids. That school has continued its tradition. It's located in Jamaica Estates now, and you can see the kids from all kinds of genetic backgrounds. Actually, it's the kind of scene I see here when I look out into the audience and the kind of scene that I see in so many schools in Queens. This is the symbol of the Second World's Fair, 1964. It's the Unisphere, which says a lot. It's the unofficial symbol of Queens and sort of indicates where Queens is heading. At that fair, there were two large pavilions. This was the Taiwanese pavilion. This is the Korean pavilion. This has something to do with the fact that we have large communities of Taiwanese and Koreans in Flushing. It was a 2-year fair, so the people who ran these large pavilions slept over. Many of the pavilions were staffed by people who slept over in Queens for that intervening year, and they were there for something else that happened in 1965, which is a coincidence. Second day of the fair is 1965. The other thing, big coincidence in 1965, is the change in our immigration laws, when suddenly people from all over the world were welcome to settle here, not just people based on quotas of outmoded European system that had existed until that time. So our immigration laws change, and among the first people that are enabled to take advantage of those new laws are the people who had experienced living in Queens and working at the World's Fair. So that's the beginning of it, and Queens becomes the place where so many new immigrants are settling. Where are they living? In places where the old Caucasian community is leaving. If you know the late 60s and early 70s, there's a mass migration out of Queens of older people who are dying or retiring, and the Caucasian people are not moving in, and the young people are going to California. So it's the place where immigrants who have some education and some money are moving into former middle-class neighborhoods in Queens. I don't know how many of you remember this one. But it was probably the best episode in All in the Family, and All in the Family says a lot about Queens. All in the Family begins in 1970. This is 5 years after the immigration law at Queens, right after the late 60s and early 70s, when so many social issues were being aired, and Archie Bunker and the All in the Family show made the first, what I call, reality sitcom, where they called it like it was. I think everyone my age knew an Archie Bunker, and knew an Edith Bunker, and knew a Mike, and knew a Gloria, and Archie Bunker was fictional, of course, but he was real. And he was facing all the changes that were taking place in Queens. Black-white immigration, immigrants moving in, women's liberation, gay liberation, all the things that were raised in the 60s and were first being really put into practice when we came into our civil rights legislation. So this is the best episode ever. I remember when Sammy Davis walks into Archie Bunker's house, and Archie Bunker says, "Oh my God, the ace of spades." And he gives him a kiss. It's just such a memorable issue. And of course, Archie Bunker was using words like coons and dagos to describe blacks and Italians. I mean, this was unheard of before. He told it like it was in terms of the working class people of Queens. So working class Queens was teaching a lesson to America on how to deal with these changes. That's Archie Bunker's house. It was supposed to be 704 Hauser Street in Astoria. In reality, it was 8960 Cooper Avenue in Glendale. It's the one in the center. This is a different house. A generation later, it's Doug Heffernan's house and King of Queens. Now, King of Queens, if you've seen that program, is a generation later. It doesn't deal with all the social issues. It mostly deals with Doug and his wife. But by this time, Doug's best friend Deacon is black. He doesn't have to, he doesn't have to worry about the coons anymore. What has happened in Queens since then is not just the diversification of the population that has been alluded to already by several people, and I often talked about that too, but I think I go one step further. We are now entering the era of the hybridization of our culture and population. Not only do we have all these different people here, they're beginning to mix it up. The second generation of these immigrants are often genetic products of two different parents coming from two different cultures, two different genetic backgrounds. And the food is changing, and the culture is changing. This is the inside of a Korean-French bakery in Flushing called Paris Baguette, run by Koreans. This is the, you can see on the side, it said, what does it say? It's a Chinese restaurant, but if you know your Asian characters, this is Korean characters. This is a Korean Chinese restaurant about a couple blocks from where I live. And if you go in there, you'll see, like you get ketchup on every diner table, you get kimchi, which is the favorite Korean condiment on your table, even though it's a Chinese restaurant. They serve Chinese-like food, but there's a lot of Korean stuff in there too. This is a kosher Mexican restaurant in Kew Garden Hills, Carlos and Gabby's. This is an Indian pizzeria in Richmond Hill. This is a halal, meaning Muslim kosher restaurant, Chinese kosher restaurant called Spice. This is an Asian fusion restaurant in Sunnyside. This is the menu of Sitio Samba Sabor in Astoria, which has on the left a Cuban menu, on the right a Peruvian menu, and on another page they have a Brazilian menu. This is at Flushing Town Hall in a series of programs called Cultural Crossroads. There were 5 programs. What they did in each program was have a musical dancing group from one culture perform, then another culture perform, and then they would jam together. And in the beginning, there would be dance lessons from both sides. So this is one of the dance lessons, but here were the combinations. Brazil meets India, Africa meets Peru, Korea meets Greece, Jamaica meets Spain, Dominican Republic meets Garifuna. And this happened in Flushing Town Hall last spring, and I think that's what's coming. This is the Gay Pride March in Jackson Heights. You'll see a lot of Latino flags in the background. This is really an immigrant march as much as it is a gay pride march. And you'll see people from different cultures marching together, and many gay people have formed partnerships with people from different cultures, as have people intermarried as well. And now, of course, we have gay marriages, and gay marriages from different cultures are taking place as well. And this is me, and I do walking tours. My website is www.giagnyc.com, and here are some walking tours that are coming up. You can go to the website and get more details. On Sunday, I'm walking in Long Island City. On October 19th in Flushing's Koreatown, November 23rd in Astoria, and February 2nd, which will be my 71st birthday, my childhood in Bayside. Thank you.